Welcome to the first episode of The Catch-Up, a new podcast from The Daily Catch where we go inside the news. My name is Walter Mullen, and I'm the publisher of The Daily Catch.
And my name is Emily Sacker, and I'm your editor-in-chief.
The podcast is produced with the help of Radio Free Rhinecliff. In this podcast, we discuss stories that have appeared in The Daily Catch. We give you insights into how we put the stories together, offer some additional observations, and discuss where the stories may be heading as we move forward. Emily, ready to catch up?
I am ready to go.
Let's start with the LeClaire Martial Arts Academy story.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just remind listeners about the background on that story, how it started, and where it is at the moment?
Absolutely. And it gives us a chance to explain why we're even covering it in the first place. So on February the 5th, a young man who works at LeClaire, who's actually the son of the founder, was arrested by state police and charged with child sexual abuse. And we got the release from the state police, and we initially decided to pass on the story because I didn't see a relationship really to the Rhinebeck and Red Hook communities that we cover. But after a few days passed, we got a number of calls from readers who reminded me that there is a small outpost of the LeClaire Academy franchise in Rhinebeck. It sits right behind the Bread Alone in the little courtyard back there. And families wanted to know whether that particular location was involved, whether the gentleman had worked at that location. And another thing that came to be important is that both Red Hook and Rhinebeck have members of the community who work out at the Hyde Park location, which is the anchor location of LeClaire's. So suddenly, our initial decision to pass on the story seemed maybe not a mistake, but maybe something we needed to revisit. And this happens with stories all the time. So we decided to dig in, and our initial angle was the Rhinebeck location. Just what I said. Was it involved? Was it included? What was going to be the impact on the Rhinebeck location? Because also, several days later, that location looked like it was going to shut down, and it wasn't clear for how long. So skip forward a couple weeks. Where we are now is we have procured an interview with a young woman who was at one time the victim of the senior Mr. LeClaire, Robert Patrick LeClaire Sr. He had been a victim of underage, essentially, rape, which is a consensual activity, but in which the law alleges that you're too young to give consent. So although you may have given what you thought was consent, you're really too young to know and understand your own motives at that point. So we got that exclusive story, and then
let's pause there for just a moment.
Sure.
So as an editor, how do you approach a very sensitive story like that mindfully and respectfully, but also professionally?
I think the key, you just named it, is mindfully and respectfully. We recognize that it's easy to make a mistake with a story like this. For example, initially we published a photograph very early in the story sequence of the team. LeClaire's harnessed a very successful, nationally recognized women's performance demonstration team in which there were several members of our community who participated. And we had procured those photos completely legitimately. There wasn't anything untoward about them. They're all over the internet. There are videos all over the internet. But some parents reacted and were very angry with the Daily Catch. And as I thought about it, I understood, there was no ill motive on our part. In fact, we were trying to sort of balance what was going on at that moment by including photographs. But we decided that the story was important. It involved a number of people. It involved an activity that was very important to many members of the community. It involved both parents and children. And it started to have legs outside of any decision the Daily Catch made.
Well, talk about the legislation that's now being proposed to fix this loophole.
Yes, exactly. So when I talk about the legs that the story began to take on, a group began to surface called No Predators in Kids Spaces. They set up a very active Facebook group. I think it now has 815 members. It grew very, very quickly. And that group began to hold demonstration marches and protests, not so much marches as protests, to ask for a change to be made. And they, with some work that we at the Daily Catch did, uncovered that state education law has a loophole by which after-school programs for children, both tutoring agencies and dance studios and art programs, do not need to have background checks for their staff.
When they're single subject
Exactly.
locations,
Very,
right?
very precise.
Yeah.
Exactly. So A summer camp is a different can of worms. A daycare center is cleared in the education law, must have background checks. Schools, of course, must run their staff through background checks, criminal background checks. But these single outlet facilities, these single subject facilities do not.
Let's say that I opened an after-school pottery location and a combined martial arts. In that case, I wouldn't qualify for the loophole because it's a dual subject.
I think, though, that will be clarified if this law it sees the light of day. And it now has bipartisan support. So as this group, No Predators in Kids Spaces, began to gain some traction, and as some of the people from that group reached out to me, we decided that this was worth covering. So along the way, a story can pick up steam, and that's what's happened with this one. And we're going to continue to follow it through because now we see there's interest in the subject because for the very reason you mentioned, there are many other kinds of after-school programs that are now or will be covered if this loophole is corrected.
What's the timeline with having the loophole corrected?
So we're in the middle of the state legislative session right now. The bill has been introduced in the Assembly. There is a Senate version of it that our state senator, Michelle Hinchy, is working on. Theoretically, this will pass both houses of the legislature and be signed by the governor in the current legislative session, which ends in a few months.
So readers can expect to see more about this in the Daily Catch?
They can.
Moving forward?
We will hook you with this story.
Great.
There's one other thing I just want to add about this. I think we've mentioned this before, Walter. There is this notion of if it bleeds, it leads. And this is the kind of story that kind of falls into that. It's got that sort of salacious content, and it's controversial, and it incites a lot of passion and meaning and feeling for people. And I would be lying to you if I said we don't cover stories like that. Of course, we listen, and we know that our readers care about those kinds of stories, and they get a lot of readership for us. And we're not interested in clickbait because we don't sell advertising against these stories, but we certainly want our readers to feel that we're paying attention to things that are on their minds and things they're talking about and things they're gossiping about even. So there's a very fine line, and I hope that we skirt that and cross that carefully.
Let's move on to our next topic, which might not be as exciting and salacious.
Oh, I think it is.
But it's important. The village board elections on Tuesday. So we have the Rhinebeck Village Board election and we have the Red Hook Village Board election. The Red Hook Village Board election on Tuesday is interesting because there are 5 people running.
That's right. And we also have the Tivoli elections as well. And something different happening in all the communities. So let me just go through that really quickly, and then we'll talk about Red Hook. So in Rhinebeck, we have the mayor, Gary Bassett, running unopposed. He's the only one. Well, I shouldn't say that, actually. In Tivoli, we have a mayoral election as well. So we don't in Red Hook. We do in Tivoli and Rhinebeck. In Rhinebeck, we also have 2 seats on the village board, so 2 trustee seats up for re-election, and there are 3 candidates. So there is a competitive election in Rhinebeck as well. Although Rhinebeck has such a small number of Republican voters that Derek Sinon, the candidate for the Republican seat, is widely considered to be not electable right now. So I don't expect to see a very contentious election in Rhinebeck. In Tivoli, similarly, we have 1 candidate up for mayor. It's a new candidate for mayor, Emily Major, who's been the deputy mayor, widely considered to be a shoo-in for the position. She's running unopposed. And there are 2 open trustee seats, both being contested by 2 incumbents, so running unopposed. So the Tivoli election is the simplest election of all of them. Now watch me be upended and write-in campaigns going on and something crazy happens. Red Hook Village is a completely different animal from the other 2. We have, for the first time ever that anyone can remember, any historian, any longtime resident of Red Hook Village, not the town, the village, 5 candidates competing for 2 seats. Now, one of those seats is currently held by the deputy mayor, Malcorca Carval, and Malcorca is considered to be kind of the heir apparent for that seat and likely to hold on, in part because something very unusual has happened as well in Red Hook, which is the mayor has weighed into the election and given an endorsement. Now, Red Hook Village does not have Republicans and Democrats. People don't run on those conventional partisan party lines. Instead, you declare yourself a member of your own party, you give it a name, and you run. We have opposite Malcorca 4 other candidates. So there are 2 seats, one of which is held by Malcorca, and then there are 4 others, as I mentioned. So we have Camille Norvell, we have Jason Baker, we have Savannah Lucas Sanchez, a fairly recent Bard graduate, and Fran Uku. And they those 4 people and Malcorca will be competing for 2 seats.
What do you attribute to the large number of people running? Just what do you think?
Everyone's reading the Daily Catch. It's all about us. Well, we are seeing record engagement in elections since we came into being, and especially in the last 2 years. And this is not true just in the village of Red Hook. This is also true in school board elections. We're seeing more people running. We're seeing very high turnout at the polls. And I genuinely, I only want to pat myself on the back lightly and pat us on the back, Walter. I think that when people know more about what's going on, when they see the ease with which they can enter the race, when they see the ways in which they can drum up support among their friends, when they see interest in issues, when they see the topics that are being brought to the fore are available for public discussion and discourse, it makes them more interested in running. It makes them more interested in campaigning. It makes people more likely to turn out. Karen Smythe, the mayor of Red Hook Village, told me the other day she's expecting record turnout for this election. So we'll see if that comes to bear, but I think that that's one of the big reasons.
What do you think will be on the mind of voters as they walk into the polls in Red Hook on Tuesday?
Who's going to win? You know, it's a contentious moment in American politics generally, right? What's coming out of Washington. I wonder to what extent that influences the great deal of passionate interest we have, even in an election like that in Red Hook Village, where there are no partisan politics. The topics are not those of budget cuts and the kinds of things we're seeing out of Doge and Trump and so forth. Those are not the topics that are on the ballot, so to speak. But they're in the minds of voters, and they may draw people to the polls.
A reminder to our listeners, the elections take place on this Tuesday, March 18th.
From noon to 9 p.m.
Is that in all 3 locations?
In all 3 locations.
Noon to 9
in Village, the voting is at the firehouse in the villages of Red Hook, and Rhinebeck, it's at their village halls.
So you just talked about what's coming out of Washington.
Yes.
So let's move to our third and final discussion topic about how we take the flurry of activity happening in Washington and
Yes.
how we report it locally.
Yes.
And recently, some of our readers have reached out to you and asked, why are we not covering more about the activity in Washington? You responded to that in one of our recent newsletters.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to read right now part of what you said in that newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
Quote, this is what you wrote. We aim, above all else, to be your steady and reliable provider of hyper-local news. In a time when so much media feels distant, divisive, or overwhelming, we believe the most meaningful stories we can tell are the ones that unfold right here, on our streets, in our schools, at our town and village meetings, and in the work of so many interesting people. So let's talk about this. How do you take these big national activities and how do we localize them down to Red Hook and Rhinebeck?
Yes. I'm so glad you brought this up because it weighs on me, right? We have a staff of 3 full-time reporters. We have 1 in Rhinebeck. We have 1 in Red Hook. We have 1 floating now between the 2 covering the Board of Ed. They are busy from the minute they wake up, which I hope is very early, till the minute they go to bed, which I hope is very late. And they are thinking about these communities. Imagine if we also had to layer on, and now I'm going to send you down to Washington to cover the budget or to cover this cut. We couldn't do it. So part of this is a decision of scarce resources. But we are able, and we do cover things that have import and that are relevant to the topics in Washington. Give you 2 examples. A couple of maybe it's 3 weeks or so ago by now, I got a tip from a member of the faculty at Bard College that Bard was stripping DEI language off of its website, a direct outgrowth of the threats coming out of the new Trump administration. That's a perfect localization of a story. We dug in on that. We called, first of all, we pulled examples of this DEI restriction, pulled the changes off the websites. There are sites you can do that'll look at what a site looked like, what it looks like today. We pulled those off, so we had screenshots. We then talked to the director of public affairs at Bard about what exactly was going on, and we put out, I think, a really important example story of what happens locally. We did a story last week off of, or maybe 10 days ago by now, about the first report out of the comptroller's office in Dutchess County about what impact various budget cuts looked like they would have on the Dutchess County budget. Another example of localizing a story. We are paying very close attention right now to what will happen or may happen to the Social Security office in Poughkeepsie. We've gone down, we've taken pictures, we've talked to people. We're waiting to see what happens. So sometimes there are waiting games We don't know yet what's going to happen if the state education department budget is really cut beyond the cuts that we've seen to jobs. What impact will that have on local schools? We don't think it will have a very big impact, but we're paying very close attention. We're ready to pounce, but we're going to pounce locally. We're not going to try to nationalize a story here.
And part of the pouncing is to decide, is it hypothetical or is it actual?
Perfect. I'm so glad you said that, because we could chase hypothetical stories till the cows come home. And meanwhile, miss the local story that happened just last week about what's going to happen to the parking in Rhinecliff Village as the town of Rhinebeck tries to figure out a viable parking plan to deal with all the people who are using Amtrak. So if we choose to cover X, we are not choosing to cover Y. Something has to give. We've decided that we're going to focus locally. Now, there's another thing that's very important. A number of our readers want us to, quote unquote, take a stand. They want us to explain why we aren't talking about the chaos in Washington, why we aren't talking about how awful Trump and Elon Musk are. I want to remind our readers and our listeners today that we are a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom. That requires us to ensure that we do not take a stand. And in fact, if we do, we can get in a lot of trouble. We can lose our 501c3 status, and then we will not be able to fundraise. If we cannot fundraise, the paper ceases to exist. So I ask our listeners to consider what they want. Do you really want the Daily Catch to risk its 501c3 status and take a stand on something? Or would you rather get that national news from any of 1,000 sources out there and let the Daily Catch do what we uniquely do alone, which is cover local news?
Cover local news. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well said. So let's shake off the heavy stuff and let's close out today's podcast with a new feature. Well, the whole podcast is new, but we're calling this Our Top 3 Listeners May Find Interesting.
I can't wait to hear yours, Walter.
I'm going to go first. So my first recommendation is the Mountains magazine. And anyone who knows me knows I am a magazine junkie. Love, love, love magazines. And the Mountains has been publishing, I think they're going on their second or third year. They publish every quarter and they do a great job. And they cover not just the Hudson Valley, but they also cover Berkshire, the Berkshires and Litchfield County. And I think it's like having a Vanity Fair right here in our own backyard.
Awesome.
So shout out to Alan Katz, the founder and CEO, and Richard Perez-Feria, the editor-in-chief. They do a great job. That's my number one.
Oh, I can't wait for number 2.
My number 2 is the Corner Counter in Red Hook. The Corner Counter is a wonderful cheese and food provision store right at the Four Corners in Red Hook, owned by Lauren Cunningham. I'm a frequent customer. Love, 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 love everything there. Lauren recently introduced garlic bread. And I said, oh, Lauren, please. Now I have to contend with garlic bread. So, but love the Corner Counter. If you haven't gone to the Corner Counter, be sure to check it out.
She also has great gifts.
Great gifts, exactly.
Great food gifts.
And her quiche is fantastic. My third and final top 3 is much further afield. It's a Broadway musical. It's a new musical that's running down in the city right now called Maybe Happy Ending. And I'm recommending this to anyone I can because it's a brand new original musical. It's very inventive. It's very clever. It's very moving. So if you're going down to New York and you want to see something, check out Maybe Happy Ending at the Belasco Theater.
Fantastic.
Those are my top 3. What are your top 3?
All right. Well, I've been giving it a little thought. I'm going to recommend the chocolate chip scone at Taste Buds Cafe. Now, this is a very embarrassing thing to admit to all of you. I eat one every single day. Every single day. And I am there so often, they now let me pick out my own scone. And I will ask them to lift this one and lift that one and lift this one until I get the one I like. And what I'm doing is I'm counting the chocolate chips from above. Okay, that's number 1.
To maximize your chocolate chip. Yeah.
Number 2, I'm going to really embarrass myself here. Elizabeth Spinzia's hair. Elizabeth Spinzia is the supervisor in Rhinebeck, okay? She has the most fabulous, fabulous hair. If you read Mrs. Frizzle and the Magic School Bus to your children, think that. But hers is not really frizzy. And it's this perfect color of kind of gray and black. And this is where I'm going to embarrass myself. I've asked her if I can touch her curls, and she said I can. But we flirt about this, but we never have actually done it. Okay. Number 3, I'm going to give a shout out now to another civic leader, Gary Bassett, mayor. So I wrote about this in the newsletter today, actually, for Rhinebeck. When you have a moment, take a walk down Chestnut Street, all the way to the end. Start in the village, walk all the way down, past the beautiful houses, and keep going, and you'll get to the most beautiful little streets down there, where apparently there was a little estates project. I'm forgetting the name of it. Seymour Estates, maybe, 1975. There's a big flooding problem down there, but that's not why you're going. You're going to just walk. And then when you get to the dead end, the end of the street, turn left and walk up, and you'll see these beautiful woodlands right there in Rhinebeck.
And did Gary Bassett show you this?
He showed me this because I was doing a story off of the village board meeting on Tuesday about a plan to deal with the flooding there, to put in a 36-inch PVC-style pipe under the ground. And I couldn't figure out where the flooding was actually occurring because there's no flooding now. And he agreed to come out and show me, give a little field trip on gravity flow and water. And I learned about a new part of Rhinebeck I'd never seen before. How's that for my 3?
Wonderful.
All right.
Wonderful. Great.
Good.
Great. This concludes the first episode of The Catch Up. We hope you enjoyed listening. We plan to produce new episodes twice a month. And a big thank you to Matty Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud at Radio Free Rhinecliff for their help in producing today's episode. Emily, it's been a pleasure catching up with you today.
You hooked me, Walter.